Have you ever noticed how love seems different when you're older? Not necessarily softer, just deeper, quieter, and maybe a little wiser. You've lived through enough to know that love isn't just about butterflies and romance anymore. It's about feeling safe, being seen, having someone to sit beside at the end of the day who knows your silence, not just your stories. That's why, for many people over 60, the idea of remarrying feels like a second chance, a beautiful one. After all the heartbreak, the loss, or the long years of raising families and holding things together, it feels like you finally get to choose something just for you. But here's something most people won't say out loud. Remarrying at this age isn't as simple as it sounds. It's not like it was in your 30s or 40s. There are deeper layers now. Legal layers, family dynamics, financial risks, and the emotional weight of lives that have already been lived. That doesn't mean it's wrong. It just means you deserve to walk into it with open eyes and a heart that's protected, not just hopeful. Because the truth is, love after 60 can absolutely bloom. It can be the sweetest season of all, but only if you know what you're walking into. Today, we're going to talk about some of the hard truths about remarrying later in life. Not to scare you, but to help you prepare. Because after everything you've been through, you don't just deserve love. You deserve a love that lasts without unraveling everything you've worked so hard to build. Let's start with something that surprises a lot of people: their own children. Mary was 68 when she met Tom. She'd lost her husband of 40 years and thought the chapter on romance was closed for good. Then she met Tom at a community book club in their small town in Ohio. He made her laugh again. He knew how to sit quietly without needing to fill the air. It felt peaceful, not overwhelming. And that was new. They dated for a year, slow and gentle. Walks in the park, potluck dinners, Sunday crossword puzzles. But when Mary told her daughter, Linda, that she was getting remarried, the room went quiet. Her daughter's smile faded, and for weeks after, the phone calls were shorter, the visits less frequent, and the silence heavier than anything Mary expected. She thought her daughter would be happy for her. Instead, Linda pulled away. The truth is, when you remarry after 60, it doesn't just change your life. It shifts the emotional foundation of your family, even if you don't intend for it to. Your children, even when grown, carry memories of the parent you lost. They remember holidays, routines, even the sound of that old laugh they used to hear in the kitchen. And when you bring someone new into that space, it can feel, to them, like a quiet erasure, even if that's not your intention. It stirs something deep and often unspoken, a feeling of being replaced or forgotten or unsure of where they now belong. Some will hide it behind politeness. Others might act out in small ways, avoiding holidays, skipping birthdays, or giving your new partner the cold shoulder. And it's not always about money or inheritance, though that can come up too. Often, it's about memory, about how fragile and precious it is to them, and how easily they feel it being rewritten. This doesn't mean you shouldn't remarry. It just means you have to walk that path gently, with awareness, with care. You don't need permission from your children to love again, but offering them space to feel their feelings without judgment can go a long way. So, talk to them early, not to ask for approval, but to let them know they still matter to you. Let them be honest, even if it's hard to hear, and be patient. Your love story doesn't have to replace what was. It can honor it. You can build something new without erasing the past. It just takes time, and sometimes more compassion than you expected. Now let's talk about something that even fewer people want to bring up: caregiving. George was 72 when he met Helen. She was 69, full of energy and loved to dance. They met in a gentle yoga class in Florida. Every week, he'd find a spot on the mat next to hers. Within a few months, they were inseparable. Visiting art fairs, watching classic movies, making pancakes on Sunday mornings. They moved in together after a year and a half. A simple ceremony in their backyard, kids and grandkids all around. For George, it felt like a fresh start. But 2 years into their marriage, everything changed. Helen started forgetting things. Little things at first. Keys, names, recipes. Then it got worse. The diagnosis came, early onset Alzheimer's. And just like that, George's days shifted from morning kisses to pill schedules and doctor appointments. He never saw it coming. You see, at this stage of life, falling in love again often means stepping into something else entirely. Caregiving. And unlike taking care of a parent or a sibling, caregiving for a spouse hits different. Because you're watching someone you chose, someone you built a new dream with, slowly disappear. Sometimes it's slow. Other times it's sudden. A fall, a stroke, a cancer diagnosis. And just like that, the long walks and quiet dinners are replaced with physical therapy, medications, and exhaustion. Love doesn't stop, but the weight it carries changes. And here's the truth that many feel too guilty to say out loud. It's hard. It's draining. It's isolating. And no matter how much you love someone, caregiving without a plan can lead to burnout, resentment, and the painful feeling of being trapped in something you didn't agree to. This is why those tough conversations need to happen before the vows. What happens if one of you gets sick? What kind of care would you want? Would you expect your partner to provide it? Or bring in help? Do you have a plan for long-term care? For finances? For emotional support? These aren't romantic questions, but they're necessary ones. Because love in later life must be shaped by realism as much as by romance. You can't build something stable without a clear foundation. And part of that foundation includes knowing what care looks like and where your limits are. You don't have to do everything yourself. You can love someone deeply and still set boundaries that protect your well-being. You can say yes to companionship and still say no to sacrificing your own health in the process. George loved Helen with all his heart, and he still does. But he told me one day, "I wish we had talked about this before. I wasn't ready. I didn't know what I was saying yes to." That's why it's so important to go into this chapter of life with clarity, not just hope. Because the greatest kind of love, the kind that truly lasts, isn't just about holding hands through the good days. It's about planning for the hard ones, so that when they come, you're not caught off guard. You're ready. Together. When you've lived through enough years, you start to realize that love alone isn't always enough to keep life steady. It brings warmth, yes. It brings laughter and hope and the joy of feeling connected again. But it also brings complications. Especially when you try to blend two separate lives with decades of history, habits, and hard-earned assets. That's what happened to Robert. At 71, he thought he had done everything right. A retired school principal in California, Robert met Patricia at a community fundraiser. She was 67, charming, smart, and shared his love of gardening. They dated for a while, then tied the knot in a sweet, simple ceremony with their adult kids and grandkids all present. Everything felt easy at first, until it wasn't. A few months into their marriage, Robert discovered Patricia was carrying over $40,000 in credit card debt. Not because she was irresponsible. She had spent years caring for her sick sister and used credit to cover travel, medical expenses, and home repairs. But now that debt was part of their shared reality. Suddenly, the savings Robert had worked his whole life to protect started to drain. And worse, the plans he had made to leave part of his estate to his grandchildren to help his daughter buy a home were now tangled up in Patricia's financial obligations. Conversations turned into arguments. Trust began to crack. Here's the truth a lot of people don't want to face. When you remarry after 60, your finances don't reset. They combine. And if you're not careful, you can go from financial freedom to financial frustration faster than you ever expected. When you're young and building a life with someone, you often start from scratch. Shared dreams, shared debts, shared goals. But in your 60s or 70s, things are different. You come in with your own savings, your own habits, your own family expectations, and so do they. That doesn't mean you can't build something together. It just means you need to be clear about what you're building and how. That means talking about money. Yes, even if it's uncomfortable, yes, even if it feels unromantic, even if you were raised to believe we don't talk about these things. Because here's the truth. Not talking about it doesn't protect the relationship. It just invites misunderstanding. Before you merge bank accounts or buy a house together, sit down with someone who understands senior financial planning. Ask the hard questions. How much debt are you each carrying? What are your long-term goals? Do you plan to help adult children financially? What happens if one of you passes away first? Will accounts be kept separate? Will you sign a prenuptial agreement? That last one especially makes people squirm. But let me tell you, signing a prenup at this age isn't about planning for divorce. It's about protecting what you've built. It says, I respect you, and I respect myself. And I want us both to be safe, no matter what happens. Because love, as beautiful as it is, should never put your stability at risk. You can be generous without being unwise. You can be open-hearted and still protect your future. Those things are not in conflict. In fact, they're part of the same kind of grown-up love that recognizes how precious your peace of mind really is. Which brings me to Susan. She was 66 when she met Frank. Both widowed, both retired, and both thrilled to find someone who understood the ache of grief and the joy of second chances. Susan owned her home outright, had a small nest egg, and had already made her will, leaving everything to her 2 sons. But she didn't know that, in Texas, where she lived, marrying someone new can override parts of your estate plan, even if your will says otherwise. She and Frank never talked to a lawyer. They just trusted their intentions. Then, last year, Susan passed away unexpectedly, and Frank, as her legal spouse, was automatically entitled to a portion of the home and assets Susan had assumed would go entirely to her children. There was no prenup, no updated estate plan, no conversation. Just confusion, hurt, and legal battles between her new husband and her sons. 2 people she had loved dearly, now pitted against each other by paperwork she never thought she needed. This is the kind of situation no one talks about. When you're wearing the dress, cutting the cake, and dancing under the backyard lights. But it's very real. And unfortunately, very common. Because legally, marriage is not just an emotional bond. It's a contract. And when you're over 60, that contract can carry heavy implications. A new spouse may gain rights to your estate, your Social Security benefits, your medical decisions. If they have debt, you might become responsible for it. If they need long-term care, Medicaid could count your assets when calculating their eligibility. And if your family has questions about your wishes, the law may prioritize your new spouse, even if you haven't been married long. The law doesn't see love. It sees legal status. And unless you protect yourself with proper documentation, you may find that everything you thought was safe, your home, your healthcare plan, your legacy, is suddenly on shaky ground. But here's the good news. You're not powerless. You can make sure your wishes are honored and your loved ones protected. All it takes is a little preparation and the willingness to have some uncomfortable conversations now rather than painful ones later. Talk to an elder law attorney. Update your will. Adjust your power of attorney. Discuss a trust if needed. And yes, consider that prenup. You've spent a lifetime building a home, a family, a sense of peace. Don't let one signature undo it. And if you're worried about how that will sound to your partner, just remember, if this love is truly built on respect, they'll understand. They'll want the same clarity you do. Because protecting each other starts with being honest, not just romantic. So whether you're newly in love, thinking about marriage, or already remarried, take a moment to ask yourself, have we talked about the things that really matter? Have we protected each other not just emotionally, but legally and financially? Because love, real love, should be brave enough to handle these questions. There's a quiet kind of erosion that can happen in later life relationships, not from arguments or betrayal, but from something gentler, sneakier, and much harder to notice. Control. Elaine had always been independent. At 65, she was retired from her job as a nurse in North Carolina, owned her own home, and had a solid circle of friends she'd known since her 20s. After losing her husband to cancer, she spent years rebuilding her life, learning to enjoy her own company, volunteering at a local animal shelter, and traveling with a friend group she adored. Then came Harold. He was charming, attentive, and full of compliments. They met at a church social, started attending concerts together, and soon were spending nearly every day side by side. When he asked her to marry him, she hesitated. But everyone said, "Elaine, you deserve to be happy again." And she wanted to believe that. The first signs were small. Harold would make comments about her friends. Nothing cruel, just little things like, "They don't really understand you the way I do." Then he started asking her to cancel plans. "You don't need to go out tonight. Let's just stay in." He insisted on managing the household bills, so she wouldn't have to worry. Over time, he began questioning what she wore, what she ate, how she spent her time. And Elaine, without even realizing it, began to shrink. What started as sweet concern turned into a slow erasure. Her world got smaller, her confidence quieter, her smile less frequent. But on the outside, everything looked fine. To neighbors and acquaintances, they were the perfect couple, always together, never arguing. What they didn't see was Elaine slowly disappearing inside her own life. Control doesn't always come with shouting or slamming doors. Sometimes it comes cloaked in affection. It sounds like, "I'm just protecting you," or "You don't need to handle that anymore." But what it really means is, you're losing your voice, your choices, your independence. And here's the hard truth. Even after 60, it can happen to anyone. Especially in later life, there's a fear most people don't like to admit out loud. The fear of being alone. That fear can make us overlook the red flags we once swore we'd never ignore. It can convince us that comfort is more important than freedom, that a quiet, controlled life is better than an empty house. But you weren't made to shrink. You weren't made to hand over your keys, your calendar, or your confidence just because someone says, "I love you." Love should make your life feel bigger, not smaller. It should give you room to breathe, to laugh, to be fully yourself, not someone else's version of who you should be. So if you find yourself asking for permission to do things you once did freely, If your circle has gotten smaller, if your voice has softened not out of peace but out of fear of upsetting someone, you owe it to yourself to pause, to reflect, to speak up. You still have the right to choose, to say no, to make your own decisions. And if someone is truly the right partner, they'll want that for you too. Now, I want to talk about something most people don't prepare for. Because let's be honest, no one wants to. Divorce. It's often called gray divorce when it happens after 60. But there's nothing soft about it. When a marriage ends in your 30s or 40s, it hurts. But you tell yourself you've got time to rebuild. Time to earn more money, find someone new, maybe even start a family. But when divorce comes in your 60s or 70s, the stakes are different. James, a 74-year-old retired engineer in Arizona, married for the second time after being widowed. His new wife, Carol, was lively, spiritual, and brought joy back into his life. They traveled, cooked together, hosted dinner parties. For a while, things felt light again. But slowly, small conflicts became deep rifts. Differences in parenting styles, financial goals, and expectations about retirement grew into something neither of them could ignore. After 7 years of trying, they decided to separate. James was heartbroken. But the emotional toll wasn't the only cost. Legally, it was exhausting. He had to split assets he'd already divided once with his late wife. He lost access to certain healthcare coverage. He had to move out of the home he helped pay for. And emotionally, he felt like he'd failed. Not just at marriage, but at finding peace in his later years. The truth is, divorce after 60 is rarely just a heartbreak. It's a financial earthquake. You may find yourself relying on adult children in ways you never expected. You may need to cut back on essentials, or even consider going back to work. Not because you want to, but because you have to. And perhaps the hardest part, the social shift. Friends pull away. Holidays become complicated. Grandkids are caught in the middle. It's not just the loss of a spouse. It's the loss of a future you believed in and the community that surrounded it. So why do people still jump into marriage quickly in later life? Because the desire for companionship is strong and valid. But if you haven't fully healed from past grief, if you haven't taken the time to relearn who you are alone, the next relationship might not be the soft landing you hoped for. It might be another round of confusion, loss, or financial hardship. That doesn't mean you should give up on love, but it does mean you should take your time. Love slowly. Ask hard questions early. Talk to people who will tell you the truth, not just what you want to hear. And most importantly, protect yourself. Emotionally, financially, legally, spiritually. You deserve love. You deserve companionship. You deserve someone to hold your hand and walk beside you into the next chapter of life. But not at the cost of your peace. Not at the cost of your independence. Not at the cost of everything you've worked so hard to build. And if you've already been through a later-in-life divorce, you're not alone. You may feel like you're starting from scratch, but what you're really doing is reclaiming your power, your space, your story. There's no shame in choosing yourself. There's no shame in learning from a choice that didn't go the way you hoped. Every step, even the hard ones, is part of your journey and your wisdom. Take a deep breath with me for a moment. Because if you've come this far, if you've sat with these stories, reflected on these truths, and felt them resonate somewhere in your chest, you already know this topic is about more than love. It's about your life, your future, your peace. Remarrying after 60 isn't wrong. It's not reckless. It's not foolish. But it is something that deserves more care than most people give it. Because the stakes are higher now. The decisions are heavier. And the consequences when things go wrong aren't just inconvenient. They can be life-altering. But here's something you might need to hear. It's still okay to want love. You're allowed to want someone who notices when you sigh, someone who pours your coffee the way you like it, someone who turns to you in the middle of the night and says, "I'm glad it's you." That longing is human. It's beautiful. And it doesn't disappear just because you're older. But now, unlike in your younger years, you bring something different to the table. Experience, wisdom, the ability to spot red flags, the courage to ask hard questions, and the strength to walk away from anything that doesn't protect your soul. This chapter of your life isn't about settling. It's about choosing with intention. So before you say yes to marriage again, take a moment to look at the full picture. Not just how someone makes you feel on the good days, but how they respond when life gets hard. Not just how you laugh together, but how you solve problems together. How they speak about your family. How they treat your boundaries. How they respect your independence. All of that matters. Because love at this stage should add to your life, not undo it. You've raised kids. You've paid bills. You've stayed up late with worry. You've grieved. You've healed. You've survived more than most people know. You don't need to prove your worth through another marriage. You don't need to complete yourself through someone else. You are already whole. If you find someone who fits into that wholeness without asking you to shrink, that's a gift. But you don't owe anyone your comfort, your time, or your future unless it feels clear, safe, and grounded. And if you're already remarried and quietly struggling with some of the things we've talked about, maybe your adult children are distant. Maybe the caregiving is taking a toll. Maybe your finances feel more tangled than secure. You are not a failure. You are not trapped. You're simply in a very human moment that deserves compassion, not shame. What matters most is how you respond to it now. Have the conversations. Set the boundaries. Ask for support. Revisit the paperwork. Reclaim your voice. Your life isn't behind you. It's still unfolding. And you get to shape it. Intentionally, courageously, even tenderly. With or without a partner. So whether you're standing at the beginning of a new love, in the middle of one, or somewhere after it all, know this. You are not too old to feel joy. You are not too late to protect what matters. And you are never wrong for wanting a life that feels both full and free. Let yourself love again. But let it be the kind of love that meets you where you are, honors where you've been, and walks beside you toward the future with honesty, not illusion. You've earned that, every bit of it. Now I'd love to hear from you. Have you considered remarrying after 60? Or maybe you've already taken that step? What's been the hardest part? Or the biggest surprise? Your story could be exactly what someone else needs to hear today. If this video gave you something to think about, something to feel, or something to talk about with a friend or loved one, please give it a thumbs up. It helps us reach more people who need these conversations. And if you haven't already, subscribe to Strong Elderly Life for more content that speaks to your heart, your experiences, and your wisdom. Because this stage of life isn't the end of your story. It's the beginning of a whole new one. Here's to living it boldly, wisely, and on your own terms. We'll see you next time.